Hey everyone, welcome to the channel. Tonight, we've some of the most disturbing true crime cases from around the world. Encounters that prove the real danger is always lurking somewhere. It's not hiding in the dark. Before we start, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is for you. Now, let's step into true crime cases together. Louise Woodward. The quaint suburban streets of Massachusetts, where the Epen family lived, seemed like the perfect setting for a young couple raising their infant son. But beneath the surface of this seemingly peaceful neighborhood, the terrifying events that would unfold would shock not only the local community, but the entire world. Louise Woodward, a 19-year-old British au pair, arrived in the U.S. with hopes of a new life and experience. But she was about to become the center of one of the most controversial and harrowing cases of child abuse in modern American history. It was early February in 1997 when 8-month-old Matthew Epen was rushed to the hospital, unresponsive and with signs of severe brain injury. The story would unfold like a nightmare. A trusted caretaker turned murderer. Matthew's parents, the Epens, had hired Louise Woodward to care for their young son, a routine hire that thousands of parents would make, trusting someone else with the care of their most precious possession. But what began as a typical day of childcare would quickly descend into something much darker. On that fateful day, Matthew was found in his crib, suffering from massive head trauma. His condition was dire. The infant was rushed to the hospital, but despite doctors' efforts, Matthew died of his injuries. In a twist that stunned both the family and investigators, Woodward was the last one to have been alone with Matthew. The case quickly turned into a mystery of shaken baby syndrome, a term that would become infamous after the trial. Was this a tragic accident, or had Woodward taken things too far in a moment of frustration? Louise, who had been entrusted with Matthew's life, seemed devastated. But in the midst of her outward distress, there were chilling inconsistencies in her story. Police quickly began to investigate Woodward. They found that the young woman had no clear explanation for Matthew's injuries. Shaken baby syndrome was the initial diagnosis, a controversial diagnosis in itself, which claims that violent shaking of an infant can cause fatal head injuries. But as evidence mounted, doubts began to creep in. Was this an accident or a cold-blooded act of violence? Was there something more sinister lurking beneath Woodward's calm demeanor? The trial that followed was a media frenzy. Louise Woodward's defense was clear. She had never intentionally harmed Matthew. However, the prosecution argued that she had inflicted the injuries, claiming that the signs of trauma suggested abuse. As the courtroom drama unfolded, the world was captivated by the details. Woodward's coolness, her ambiguous behavior, and the lack of direct evidence linking her to Matthew's death. The first verdict was one of second-degree murder, sending shockwaves through the public. But then came the unexpected. After intense scrutiny and national debate over the nature of shaken baby syndrome and Woodward's role in the death, a judge reduced the charge to involuntary manslaughter. A divided public continued to argue over the legitimacy of her conviction, with some claiming that Woodward had been the victim of a miscarriage of justice. Others believed she was guilty, but simply got away with it. Her sentence was brief. After serving 279 days in jail, Louise Woodward was released, forever remaining a controversial figure in the debate over child abuse, medical diagnoses, and justice. Was she a misunderstood young woman who made a tragic mistake? Or was she a cold killer who got away with murder? Even years later, the case remains unresolved in the minds of many. And while Woodward has lived a life mostly out of the public eye since her release, the shadow of her crime looms over her like a curse, a haunting reminder of the fragile trust placed in those who care for the most vulnerable. Yoselyn O, the towering skyline of New York City, a place of dreams and despair, of endless possibilities and unfathomable horror. It was here, amid the glittering lights and crowded streets, that a tragic event would shake the very core of a family's existence. Yoselyn O, a 50-year-old nanny, had been trusted with the care of 2 innocent children. But what was meant to be a loving caregiver role would quickly spiral into a violent act that would leave the city and the world reeling. Lucia and Leo Krim, aged 6 and 2, were the picture of childhood innocence. Their mother, Marina Krim, was a successful professional who trusted Ortega with her children while she worked. They had been a happy family, living a privileged life in one of the most famous cities on earth. But on October 25, 2012, the Krim family would find their lives shattered forever. Marina had gone out for a late swim with her husband, Kevin Krim, leaving the children in the care of their nanny, Yoselyn Ortega. It was a decision that would become one of the most tragic choices any parent could ever make. When Marina returned to her apartment that evening, she was met by a scene so horrific it seemed almost unreal. Inside the apartment, Ortega had brutally murdered both of the children. Lucia and Leo were found lifeless, their tiny bodies savagely stabbed. The nanny, once a trusted caregiver, had turned into something monstrous. Ortega, covered in blood, had also attempted to take her own life, slashing her neck in a failed suicide attempt. She was found near the children, barely alive but far from remorseful. The investigation into Ortega's actions uncovered a disturbing history. She had been with the Krim family for 2 years, and by all accounts, she had been a dedicated, reliable employee. But behind closed doors, Ortega's mental state was deteriorating. Friends and family of the Krims would later describe Ortega as an individual who had become consumed by anger and jealousy. Was she simply a deeply troubled woman who snapped, or did something more sinister lie behind her violent actions? During the trial, Ortega's defense team argued that she had been suffering from severe mental illness at the time of the murders. They claimed she was not in control of her actions when she killed the children. But the prosecution painted a different picture, one of premeditation and intentional cruelty. Ortega had, according to the prosecution, shown clear signs of planning and malice. In the months leading up to the murders, Ortega's mental health had been on a decline. Her behavior had become erratic, and she had displayed signs of paranoia. But was this enough to excuse the unthinkable act she had committed? The Krim family was left grappling with a tragedy that could never be undone. 2 innocent lives taken in the most violent manner, leaving a mother and father devastated beyond words. In April 2018, after a lengthy trial, Ortega was found guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder. The judge sentenced her to life in prison without the possibility of parole. But even that punishment seemed inadequate in the face of the horror she had inflicted. What could ever bring justice to a mother who would never see her children grow up? A family torn apart by unimaginable violence. As the world watched the sentencing, the question lingered. How could someone trusted with the most precious gift, a child's life, become a cold-hearted killer? The story of Yoselyn Ortega serves as a haunting reminder of how fragile the line is between trust and betrayal, between safety and danger. Certainly, below is the expanded documentary-style script for the next 2 serial killers, Nannie Doss and Christine Falling. Each is detailed with a compelling narrative and the necessary emotional hooks, pacing, and tone following the structure you requested. Nannie Doss. In the serene small towns of America, where neighbors wave and children play without a care, there often lies a darkness hidden beneath the surface. No one knew this better than the families who came into contact with Nannie Doss, a woman whose charm, warmth, and seemingly perfect smile were the perfect camouflage for a calculated and chilling killer. She was known as the giggling granny, and for years, no one suspected the horrors she was hiding behind that innocent, maternal face. Nannie Doss was born in 1905 in Blue Mountain, Alabama, but her tale would become tragically iconic in the United States. A mother, grandmother, and loving wife on the outside, her life and family were carefully constructed to be everything society admired in a woman. However, beneath this facade lay a much darker reality. Nannie was a serial killer, a predator who would not stop until she had ended the lives of at least 11 victims, including her own children and grandchildren. Her method was subtle, calculated, and insidious. Poisoning. It was poison that would become her signature, the silent weapon she used to slowly and methodically take the lives of her victims. Most commonly, Nannie used arsenic, an easy-to-obtain poison that left few traces and could be disguised in food or drink. Her victims, often her closest family members, had no idea that the woman they trusted most was preparing their last meal. The series of murders began to unfold in the 1920s, but it wasn't until the 1950s that authorities began to connect the dots. Doss's killing spree spanned over 3 decades, during which she moved through several marriages, each ending in death. Her ability to remain undetected for so long was a testament to the trust she gained from her victims. She was the perfect picture of a loving mother and wife, which made her crimes even more horrifying. Nannie Doss's first known victims were her 2 children, who mysteriously died under questionable circumstances. However, it wasn't until she married again that things started to unravel. Her second husband, a man named Sam Doss, fell victim to her poison, but his death brought her under police scrutiny. When Nannie's third husband, Arlie Lanning, also mysteriously died after a short marriage, the authorities were forced to take a closer look. In 1954, Nannie was finally arrested for the murder of her last husband, but investigations revealed a far darker story. It wasn't just the men in her life who were victims of Nannie's twisted urges. She had also killed multiple children, including her own, and had been responsible for the deaths of numerous other family members. As authorities dug deeper, they uncovered a trail of bodies, with Nannie's name now forever linked to a killing spree that spanned several decades. The true horror of Nannie Doss's actions came to light when she was arrested and subsequently confessed to her crimes. During her time in custody, she gave detailed confessions to authorities, explaining how she had poisoned not just her husbands, but also her children, grandchildren, and other relatives. Each death was framed as a tragic accident or illness, and her nurturing nature had allowed her to cover up her actions. One of the most disturbing aspects of Doss's killings was her demeanor. She seemed to enjoy talking about the murders with a disturbing level of nonchalance. She would often laugh or smile as she recounted the details, giving her the chilling nickname, the Giggling Granny. Her casualness about the deaths of those closest to her sent shivers down the spines of investigators and the public alike. How could someone capable of such cold-blooded killings still smile, still speak about it as if it were a casual conversation? Her motive seemed equally as disturbing. Nannie Doss confessed that she had killed for the thrill of it, and that she enjoyed the power she held over life and death. She had a deep desire for attention and sought out male companionship, often luring victims through Lonely Hearts columns in newspapers. To her, each new marriage, each new victim, was a way to feel in control. She killed to keep her secrets hidden and her lifestyle intact, and each murder seemed to feed her insatiable need for control. Christine Falling. In the sun-drenched streets of Florida, families often relied on babysitters to care for their children while they were away at work. The peace of mind that came with having a trusted caregiver watching over the kids was essential in a busy, fast-paced world. But in the early 1980s, one babysitter's horrifying actions would forever change the way families looked at those who were entrusted with their most precious loved ones. Christine Falling, a quiet and unassuming woman, appeared to be the perfect candidate for the job. In her 20s, she seemed friendly, responsible, and gentle. She was someone parents could trust with their children. Yet in a cruel twist of fate, the children she was hired to protect would become her victims, and her name would forever be synonymous with one of the most horrific babysitter murders in Florida's history. Falling was convicted of the brutal murders of 3 young children in her care between 1980 and 1982. Her method of killing was shocking in its simplicity and horror: suffocation. She would smother the children with pillows or blankets, cutting off their air supply until they were lifeless. Her actions were quick and efficient, leaving the children with no chance of escape. Christine Falling's first known victim was a 4-year-old boy named Michael. Michael had been in her care for several months, and there had been no indication that anything was wrong. He was a happy, playful child, but one evening, he was found dead in his crib, suffocated by a pillow. At first, the death seemed like a tragic accident, a sudden illness, or perhaps a sleep-related issue. But as the weeks passed, more children came into her care, and more deaths followed. The second child to die under Falling's care was a 3-year-old girl named Jessica. She was found dead in her bed, also suffocated, her tiny body cold and lifeless. The pattern was starting to emerge, but no one had yet connected the dots. It wasn't until the third child, a 2-year-old boy named Andrew, died in the same disturbing manner that police finally began to take notice. All 3 deaths occurred within a span of just 2 years, each one having similar circumstances. The child had been in Christine Falling's care, and each death had been sudden and unexplained. The suffocation method, the lack of any outward signs of trauma, and the strange occurrences all pointed to something much darker at work. The investigation into the deaths began when medical examiners noticed the pattern. The 3 children had all died in similar ways, under similar circumstances, while in the care of Christine Falling. The police, initially slow to act, began to focus their attention on the babysitter. As they dug deeper into Falling's life, they found disturbing evidence of her violent tendencies and a possible motive for the killings. Christine Falling had a history of psychological issues, including depression and violent outbursts. But more chillingly, there were signs that she had been seeking control over her environment. The power she had over the children's lives was something she seemed to relish. She would often be alone with the children for long stretches of time, and many of the deaths occurred during periods when she was left unsupervised, away from the scrutiny of the children's parents. During her trial, Falling's defense team argued that she had been suffering from a mental illness that made her incapable of understanding the severity of her actions. But the prosecution argued that her crimes were deliberate and premeditated. They painted a picture of a woman who had carefully planned the murders, taking advantage of the trust placed in her by the families. In 1984, Christine Falling was convicted of the murders of 3 children and was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The verdict was met with relief, but the horror of the crimes still haunted the families involved. No amount of justice could undo the damage that had been done, and the deaths of Michael, Jessica, and Andrew remained a painful reminder of the dangers of trusting the wrong person. Gloria Fields. The quiet streets of Staten Island, New York, were about as ordinary as they come. A typical suburban neighborhood where children played on sidewalks and families lived in peace, enjoying the calm of everyday life. But in 2016, in the home of a trusted babysitter, a tragic event would shatter that peace in ways no one could have predicted. Gloria Fields was a babysitter in her 30s, a woman known for her calm demeanor and trustworthy nature. To most, she was simply another face in the crowd, a motherly figure who took care of children while their parents went about their day. Little did anyone know, Fields was hiding a dark side, one that would surface in the most horrific way imaginable. In August 2016, Fields was entrusted with the care of 17-month-old Anthony Delgado. The child was vibrant, full of life, and beloved by his family. His parents, like countless others before them, had placed their trust in a caregiver, believing that their child would be safe in her hands. But that trust would soon prove fatal. What happened that day inside the apartment where Gloria Fields was babysitting would forever haunt those who knew Anthony. The young child was brutally attacked, beaten, shaken, and subjected to horrific abuse. The extent of the violence that Fields inflicted upon Anthony was unimaginable. He was violently struck, his small body broken by the brutal force of the assault. But the trauma didn't stop there. The investigators would later reveal the unimaginable truth. Anthony had also been sodomized before he finally succumbed to his injuries. The details of Anthony's death were shocking. How could someone entrusted with his care do this to him? How could someone who was supposed to protect him turn into his worst nightmare? The injuries were so severe, so violent, that they painted a chilling portrait of the brutality that had unfolded in that room. But what would follow would be a slow unraveling of Gloria Fields' true nature. Fields' story was one of manipulation and deceit. She had carefully constructed an image of a caring, loving babysitter who could be trusted with the most precious of responsibilities. The truth, however, was far darker. Investigators quickly discovered that Fields had a history of violent behavior, a pattern of aggression that had been hidden from view. Yet no one had suspected that she could commit such a horrific crime. She had been a master of disguise, hiding her true self behind the facade of a responsible caregiver. When Fields was arrested, the shockwaves reverberated through the community. How could this happen? How could a woman who seemed so trustworthy, so kind, have done something so unspeakable? The revelations surrounding Anthony's death sent shockwaves through Staten Island, and the case quickly became a focal point of national attention. Gloria Fields was charged with the brutal murder of Anthony Delgado, and the trial that followed would bring her past to light in a way that no one could have imagined. The trial was a media sensation, with every new detail about Fields' actions coming to light in brutal detail. Prosecutors painted a picture of a woman who had brutally murdered an innocent child, showing no remorse and leaving a trail of devastation behind. Fields' defense, on the other hand, tried to argue that she was suffering from severe emotional distress at the time of the attack, but the evidence was overwhelming. The brutal nature of Anthony's death left little room for doubt. This was a calculated act of violence, not a spur-of-the-moment tragedy. In 2017, Fields was sentenced to 23 years to life in prison for her role in the death of 17-month-old Anthony Delgado. But the sentence did little to quell the anger and confusion that lingered in the wake of her horrific crime. How could someone who was entrusted with such a vulnerable life betray that trust in the most violent way possible? For Anthony's family, justice would never fully heal the wounds left behind. His life had been brutally stolen from them, and nothing could bring him back. Gloria Fields' case stands as a stark reminder of the dangers that can lurk behind the most innocent of facades. She was a babysitter, a caregiver, someone who should have been trusted, but instead, she became a monster who inflicted unimaginable suffering on an innocent child. The chilling story of Gloria Fields will forever serve as a warning, a haunting reminder of how, in the most unexpected places, evil can take root and destroy lives forever. Emily Long, Laredo, Texas, a city known for its rich culture and close-knit community. Here, life is often lived in the warmth of family and the trust of neighbors. It's a place where children laugh and play, where parents feel safe enough to entrust their kids to the care of babysitters while they go about their day. But in 2025, Laredo would become the backdrop for a tragedy that would shatter that sense of security. Emily Long, a young woman in her late 20s, was a babysitter in Laredo. On the surface, she appeared to be just another friendly, capable woman who took on the responsibility of watching over children while their parents worked. She was the kind of person who blended into the background, someone you'd never suspect could harbor darkness. But as the details of her actions began to unfold, a nightmare no one could have imagined was about to be revealed. It was in the early months of 2025 that the tragedy would strike. Long was entrusted with the care of a 6-year-old boy, along with 2 other children, while their parents were away. To the outside world, nothing seemed amiss. Emily Long appeared calm, collected, and kind. Yet the children who were under her watch would not survive the day. In what would later be described as a brutal, unthinkable act, Long killed the 6-year-old boy and the 2 other children she had been entrusted with. As investigators began piecing together the events of that fateful day, the magnitude of what had occurred became clear. The children, who had been left under Long's care, had been subjected to horrific violence. Details of the crime were scarce, but investigators quickly realized that this was no accident. Emily Long had taken the lives of 3 innocent children in her charge, and the motive behind her actions remained unclear. The shock of this act sent ripples through Laredo, as parents, family members, and the entire community struggled to comprehend how such a tragedy could have unfolded. How could someone who appeared to be so gentle, so trustworthy, commit such a horrifying act? What could possibly drive a person to murder children in such a brutal manner? These were the questions that plagued the minds of all who heard about the case. As the investigation into Emily Long's past began, authorities uncovered disturbing information. Long's background was far from spotless. Although she had no previous history of violent crime, she had been involved in incidents of troubling behavior in the past, signs that perhaps she had been hiding a much darker side beneath her quiet, composed exterior. What had driven Emily Long to commit such a horrific act? Was it something hidden in her past, a psychological issue that had gone unnoticed? Or was it something more chilling, a deliberate, calculated act of violence? At the time of this writing, the full details of Emily Long's case are still emerging. The investigation is ongoing, and authorities are working to uncover the truth behind her actions. But what is already clear is that Laredo, once a place of peace and security, will never be the same again. The image of Emily Long as a trusted babysitter will forever be stained by the horrific murders she committed. In the quiet suburban neighborhoods of Laredo, this tragedy will serve as a constant reminder of the dangers that can lurk behind the most innocent of facades. And as the investigation continues to unfold, the chilling questions of why and how will continue to haunt everyone involved. The case of Emily Long remains one of the most disturbing in recent memory. A woman, a babysitter, who killed not one, but 3 children under her watch. What could possibly drive someone to commit such an unimaginable act? And what will the final revelations about her true nature reveal? The answers may be yet to come, but one thing is certain. This is a story that will continue to grip the public's attention, and the search for the truth behind Emily Long's horrific crime will persist. Terry McCurchie. In the spring of 1984, a quiet neighborhood in the United States would unknowingly bear witness to a tragedy that would take decades to fully reveal its consequences. Terry McCurchie, a 22-year-old woman, was entrusted with the care of a precious, defenseless infant, 6-month-old Benjamin Dowling. The role of a babysitter should have been one of love and protection, but McCurchie's actions that day would betray that trust in the most violent and devastating way. Benjamin was a baby full of promise, his eyes wide with the wonder of the world around him. But on that fateful day, something went terribly wrong. What was supposed to be an ordinary babysitting session quickly turned into a nightmare. Benjamin's small body, fragile and dependent, was violently shaken by McCurchie, an act that would ultimately lead to brain damage so severe it would claim his life years later. The first signs that something was wrong came when Benjamin's parents arrived home to find their baby unresponsive, his eyes dull and vacant. The once vibrant child had been left in a state of unconsciousness, and he was quickly rushed to the hospital. The doctors were left baffled by the child's condition. What could have caused such devastating brain trauma to such a young child? But as the investigation unfolded, a disturbing truth emerged. Benjamin had suffered from blunt force trauma, consistent with violent shaking. Terry McCurchie, the babysitter entrusted with Benjamin's care, had no explanation for what had happened. The damage was irreversible. The injury to Benjamin's brain was so severe that doctors doubted he would survive. But survive he did, though in a coma-like state that left him unable to ever recover fully from the traumatic event. Years went by, and Benjamin's parents tried their best to care for him, but the toll on his body and mind was unrelenting. Though he had survived the attack, he would never live the life a normal child should. McCurchie, the woman who had been trusted to care for Benjamin, had left him with lasting damage that would haunt the Dowling family for the rest of their lives. For 35 years, Benjamin lived in a state of permanent impairment, unable to speak, walk, or experience the world in the way most of us take for granted. His condition was a constant reminder of the violent shaking that had almost claimed his life as an infant. He was a ghost of the child he could have been, his potential lost to the brutality of the woman who was meant to care for him. Then, in 2019, the unimaginable happened. Benjamin Dowling, after 35 years of suffering from the effects of McCurchie's actions, passed away. His death marked the end of a long and painful chapter for his family, who had lived every day with the knowledge that the damage inflicted upon him could never be undone. But it also reopened the legal case against Terry McCurchie, who had been convicted of manslaughter for shaking Benjamin in 1984. In 1984, McCurchie had received a sentence of 36 months in prison and 10 years of probation. But as Benjamin's death triggered a new investigation, the courts had to reevaluate her original conviction. Was she responsible for more than just manslaughter? The long passage of time made the case complicated. Despite the decades that had passed, McCurchie was again held accountable for her violent actions, which had caused irreversible harm to an innocent child. Though McCurchie had already served her sentence and was living under probation, the death of Benjamin after 35 years of suffering ultimately led to the legal system revisiting her case. The legal proceedings would never undo the damage done to Benjamin or his family. A young life had been irrevocably changed because of a moment of violence, one that left a trail of suffering lasting over 3 decades. For Benjamin's family, the trial, the legal battles, and the pain of seeing their child live a life of suffering were far from over. Terry McCurchie's story, a haunting tale of neglect and violence, served as a tragic reminder of how quickly trust can be shattered and how the ripples of an act of cruelty can extend far beyond the moment it happens. A babysitter, someone meant to care for and protect, had become the instrument of a slow, painful death that would extend for years, leaving its mark on every family member involved. Brittany Napier. In the quiet town of Ohio in 2023, the sense of peace that often accompanies family life would be shattered by a crime so heart-wrenching, so inexplicable, that it seemed almost unfathomable. Brittany Napier, a 25-year-old babysitter, was accused of killing 2-year-old Zaki Williams, a boy under her care. The child's death was not quick, nor was it merciful. It was slow, agonizing, and, perhaps most tragically, entirely preventable. Zaki Williams had been a curious, energetic toddler, his life full of possibility. He was the kind of child who could light up a room with his laugh, a reminder of the hope and joy that children bring into the world. But all of that was violently extinguished on the day that Brittany Napier chose to ignore her duty of care, and instead inflicted death upon an innocent child. The day Zaki died, it started like any other. His parents left him with Napier, trusting her to watch over him while they were away. But what was supposed to be a normal babysitting session would end in tragedy. Zaki had been placed in his playpen, a safe space where he could play, while Napier attended to other tasks. It was a place that should have offered comfort and security, but instead, it became his tomb. At some point during the day, Napier covered Zaki's playpen with a mattress. Whether it was an act of frustration, neglect, or sheer indifference to the child's well-being, we may never know. But what followed was chillingly clear. Zaki, unable to move or escape, was suffocated by the very mattress that was meant to keep him safe. The mattress smothered him as he struggled for air, his cries unheard, his tiny body trapped in a coffin-like cage. When Zaki's parents returned, they were met with a scene of unspeakable horror. Their son, their baby boy, was found lifeless in the playpen, suffocated to death by a mattress that was supposed to provide comfort and protection. In that moment, their world fell apart. How could this happen? How could someone entrusted with the care of their child do something so horrifying? The investigation into Zaki's death unfolded quickly. Authorities quickly determined that it had been a suffocation, a senseless and tragic accident that was anything but accidental. The method of Zaki's death, the placement of the mattress, pointed directly to neglect and intentional recklessness. Brittany Napier was arrested and charged with involuntary manslaughter and child neglect, crimes that seemed almost too cruel to fathom. At trial, Napier's defense attorneys claimed that she had not intended to cause harm and that the child's death had been an unfortunate accident. But the evidence told a much darker story. The death of Zaki Williams was not the result of a mistake. It was the consequence of a series of actions, of choosing to place a mattress over a child's playpen, of ignoring the risks, of abandoning any sense of responsibility. In 2023, Brittany Napier was sentenced to 1 year in prison for involuntary manslaughter, but the sentences didn't stop there. Additional years were added for child neglect, a crime that seemed to fit perfectly within the cold indifference Napier had shown toward her charge. For Zaki's parents, the court proceedings offered little solace. The loss of their young child could never be replaced by any sentence, and no amount of justice could bring back their little boy. Napier's case serves as a stark reminder of how fragile trust can be when it comes to the care of children. A babysitter is often someone entrusted with the most precious thing in the world, a child's life. And yet, for Brittany Napier, that trust was violated in the most unforgivable way. In a moment of recklessness and disregard for the safety of the child, Zaki Williams paid the ultimate price. The tragedy of Zaki Williams, his life taken before it could fully bloom, will forever be a stain on the concept of caregiving. And for Brittany Napier, the consequences of her actions will follow her for the rest of her life, a constant reminder of the innocence she took and the life she ended far too soon. Kimberly Dow. In the quiet, scenic regions of Scotland, where rolling hills meet tranquil villages and life flows at a peaceful pace, there exists an unsettling darkness. a reminder that evil can lurk in the most unexpected places. In 2022, the horror would come to light in the small town of Scotland when Kimberly Dow, a woman with a seemingly gentle demeanor, was convicted of attempting to murder a helpless 5-month-old baby. The case would send shockwaves through the community, revealing how someone trusted to care for the most vulnerable could betray that trust with violence that was beyond comprehension. Kimberly Dow had been hired to care for the infant, a child whose entire life was just beginning to unfold. At 5 months old, the baby was still discovering the world around him, his eyes wide with curiosity, his tiny hands reaching out to explore everything within his grasp. But on one fateful day in 2022, Dow, a woman who had been entrusted with the child's life, shook him violently, in a manner that would have devastating consequences. The details of the attack are horrific and difficult to process. The baby was subjected to a violent shaking that caused immense trauma to his tiny body. Shaking a child with such force can cause catastrophic brain damage, a tragedy that often leaves the child with lifelong disabilities, or worse. The infant in this case was lucky to survive, though his injuries were severe, and his future remained uncertain. He was left in critical condition, fighting for his life, all because a person who was meant to protect him chose to inflict harm. Kimberly Dow's behavior seemed incomprehensible to the authorities. How could a woman entrusted with the care of an innocent child choose to harm him so violently? What drove her to commit such a savage act? Dow's actions raised more questions than answers. The investigation quickly revealed that the child had been in Dow's care for a short period, during which she had become frustrated, leading to the horrifying attack. The trial that followed was filled with shocking details that painted a chilling picture of Dow's behavior. She had been responsible for other children in the past, but no one suspected that she was capable of such violence. Dow's demeanor throughout the trial was cold and distant, adding to the sense of unease surrounding the case. Was this an isolated act of rage, or was there a deeper issue at play? Was Dow a woman who had snapped under the pressure of caregiving, or was she someone who had always harbored a darker side? In 2022, Kimberly Dow was found guilty of attempted murder and sentenced to 8.5 years in prison. The court's verdict was a bittersweet moment for the child's family. Though they had justice, nothing could undo the damage done to their child, and they were left with the haunting reality that someone they had trusted had put their baby's life in jeopardy. Dow's conviction left many wondering about the nature of her crime. Was she simply a woman pushed to the edge by the demands of caregiving, or was there something much darker lurking beneath the surface? Her story is a reminder that even the most seemingly innocuous individuals can harbor the capacity for violence, especially when entrusted with the care of the most defenseless. As Dow serves her time, the questions surrounding her actions remain. For the child who survived, there is no going back to a normal life. His future will always be marked by the violence inflicted upon him at the hands of someone he was supposed to trust. The case of Kimberly Dow will continue to serve as a chilling reminder that evil can hide behind the most innocent of faces. Clover Boykin. The year was 1993 when a terrifying tragedy unfolded in the United States, one that would forever change the lives of 2 families and leave the world questioning how someone could harbor such monstrous intentions. Clover Boykin, a woman with a maternal presence, was responsible for the deaths of 2 infants under her care, leaving a trail of devastation in her wake. The horrific nature of her actions would stun the public and provoke widespread shock and disbelief. Boykin's first victim was 9-month-old Kayla Basante. Kayla, a happy, lively child, had been placed in Boykin's care, as was customary for many families who needed a trusted sitter. But what began as a typical arrangement would soon spiral into unspeakable horror. Kayla was found dead under Boykin's care, and the circumstances surrounding her death were nothing short of chilling. She had been violently shaken, her tiny body subjected to a level of force that no infant should ever endure. What could have driven Clover Boykin, someone entrusted with the care of a defenseless child, to commit such a brutal act? The investigation uncovered shocking evidence. Boykin, despite her outward appearance of a caring, responsible sitter, had secretly been harboring a deep rage, one that she had directed toward the children in her charge. The reason for her violent outbursts remained unclear, but the results were undeniable. Kayla's life was cut short, her potential and future erased by the hands of someone she should have been able to trust. But the horror didn't end with Kayla's death. As authorities dug deeper into Boykin's background, another horrifying discovery was made. She had also killed her own 5-month-old son, Dayton Boykin. Dayton, an infant who had been her own flesh and blood, had been subjected to the same brutal treatment that had claimed Kayla's life. He too was found dead, his young body broken and ravaged by violent shaking. How could a mother, a woman responsible for the lives of 2 innocent children, commit such atrocities? How could she end the lives of her own flesh and blood, a child she should have protected at all costs? Boykin's actions defied logic, leaving investigators and the public horrified by the depth of her violence. The trial that followed was filled with gut-wrenching testimony and emotional moments. Boykin's demeanor throughout the proceedings was cold, emotionless, as if her heart had long since hardened to the suffering she had caused. She was charged with the murder of Kayla Basanti and her own son Dayton, and the public's outrage was palpable. What would drive a person to such violence? What demons had she been battling? And why had they manifested in such tragic and irreversible ways? In the end, Clover Boykin was convicted of 2 murders. For the death of Kayla Basanti, she was sentenced to life imprisonment, while for the murder of her son Dayton, she received a 40-year sentence. The sentences were a small measure of justice for the families who had lost their children to this senseless violence. But for Kayla's family, the pain of losing a child would never go away. And for Dayton's family, the loss of a son could never be replaced. Boykin's case remains one of the most horrifying examples of the darkness that can reside in those who are meant to care for children. She was someone who should have been a protector, a nurturer, but instead became the instrument of death. The deaths of Kayla Basanti and Dayton Boykin left an indelible mark on the world, a haunting reminder of the dangers that can lie behind the facade of motherhood, and a chilling testament to the brutality that can emerge from the most unexpected of places. As Boykin serves her time, the questions around her motivations linger. What drove her to such violence? Was it something in her past that pushed her over the edge? Or was she simply a cold-blooded killer who saw no value in the lives she took? These questions remain unanswered, but one thing is certain. Clover Boykin's actions will forever be remembered as one of the most tragic and senseless series of killings in modern history. Olivia Reiner. In 1991, the quiet suburbs of America were shattered by an incident that would raise uncomfortable questions about the safety of children in the care of foreign nannies. Olivia Reiner, a 22-year-old Swiss au pair, was entrusted with the care of 3-month-old Christy Fisher, a baby with a bright future ahead of her. What was meant to be a simple arrangement for childcare would spiral into a nightmare, leaving the Fisher family with a devastating loss that would haunt them for years to come. It was a tragic night when the Fisher family's home was engulfed in flames. The fire was sudden, chaotic, and all-consuming. In the aftermath, little Christy Fisher was found lifeless, her tiny body caught in the flames. The cause of the fire was uncertain, and investigators were left with more questions than answers. How could a simple household fire have resulted in the death of a baby, so young and full of potential? As the details of the fire emerged, suspicion began to fall on Olivia Reiner. Reiner had been alone with the child at the time of the fire, and though she was unharmed, the circumstances surrounding the blaze raised suspicion. The fire was intense and appeared to have been set intentionally. Reiner, who had been hired as a live-in nanny, seemed calm and composed after the tragedy, but there was something unsettling about her behavior. She was questioned by the authorities, and a case that seemed like a tragic accident slowly began to take shape as a possible act of foul play. The prosecution argued that the fire had been deliberately set and that Reiner had played a role in it. Her connection to the death of Christy Fisher seemed undeniable, but the evidence was far from conclusive. There were no witnesses, no physical evidence linking Reiner directly to the crime, and no clear motive for her actions. As the investigation dragged on, it became clear that the case was built more on speculation and circumstantial evidence than on solid proof. Despite the mounting suspicions, Olivia Reiner was ultimately acquitted of all charges. The case was dismissed due to insufficient evidence, and she walked free, leaving behind a grieving family and a community left with more questions than answers. The ruling shocked many, as they had expected Reiner to be held accountable for Christie's death, especially given the circumstances. But the lack of concrete proof meant that the court could not find her guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. Though Reiner was acquitted, the case raised troubling concerns about the safety of children in the care of foreign nannies. Christie Fisher's death, while tragic, sparked a larger conversation about the vetting process for nannies, especially those from overseas. Many families had been left wondering if they could trust a stranger from a foreign country to care for their most vulnerable members. Reiner's case was an unsettling reminder that, while nannies and au pairs are often seen as caring figures, the danger of putting blind trust in someone with a child's life was all too real. Despite her acquittal, Olivia Reiner's name would forever be associated with the case of Christie Fisher, a tragic event that never fully left the minds of those who followed it. The unanswered questions would haunt the Fisher family, and the unsettling nature of the case would continue to raise concerns about the safety and oversight of children in the care of foreign nannies.